Okay, good morning, Dr. Edward Wasson, and good afternoon, our colleagues, wherever they are now joining the webinar. We are pleased to have Edward Wasson offering this webinar on flipping the classroom. One of the pedagogies, we would like to know more about it, and we would like to encourage our colleagues to start practicing it. Edward has a very long, very impressive CV and achievement. We have sent this out to all of you. We would like to make the best use of this 1 hour. So Edward will talk for about 40 minutes, and then at the end we'll start having questions or comments. If he said you have a very, very burning question, you can interrupt him. With that, I would like to welcome you, Edward, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to share a little bit about flipping the classroom. So I work with the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and we focus very much on faculty development and promoting best practices for higher education. For this specific session, I'll be talking, I guess I've sort of set up 3 sort of guiding questions for our time together. So I'm going to begin by talking about what we know empirically about learning these days and what it suggests for how we should teach. I'll then talk about some evidence-based best practices for course design and instruction that flow from this foundation of scholarship regarding what we know about how people learn. And then I'll kind of conclude with some sort of key practical points of guidance for those that are considering strategies such as flipping the classroom. Again, all of these sort of flow from this foundation of knowledge. In fact, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Teaching Naked Techniques, really about flipping the classroom. And sort of the teaching naked idea is a metaphor for when you're in the classroom, being as present as possible and maybe not using technology that much during the classroom, but certainly leveraging it outside of the classroom. So sort of that notion of flipping the classroom within a different kind of metaphor, teaching naked. So, you know, as you think about exploring what we know about how people learn, the logical place that we would go would be to the peer-reviewed journals. And the truth is there's a lot of journals in the higher education domain, but there's been really a renaissance of research regarding teaching and learning with brain scans and sort of more hard science educational research strategies that have confirmed a number of social science findings recently in the peer-reviewed journals. But what's really interesting about sort of the higher education space within sort of the broader set of peer-reviewed journals is there's over 700 journals within this sort of higher education teaching and learning domain, maybe some higher education administration thrown in there as well. And the truth is you can probably find an argument for and against almost every teaching and learning strategy we've ever tried in the peer-reviewed journal. So you really have to kind of be careful and look for triangulation across multiple studies or look at large-scale studies to make sure that we know exactly with certainty how students learn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by sharing 5 things regarding what we know about how people learn. And I feel these are truths that apply to whether you're teaching high school age students or students that are in college or even adult learners, that these are pretty much principles that we've seen across all sets of literature regarding sort of adult learners. So the first thing that we know about learning is that we know the importance of prior knowledge to what we're doing in the current classroom. In fact, there was a professor named David Ausubel who wrote a cognitive educational psychology book back in the 1960s that chronicled a bunch of teaching and learning strategies that were based on, at that time, what we knew about learning. Really thick book, but he distilled all of teaching and learning in his preface down to one principle. He said, find out what your students know and teach accordingly, which, you know, I hear that that advice, and that makes really good sense. You know, if you know that your students are sort of at step 3 and sort of a knowledge base in a specific domain, well, then you'd want to start at step 3 or step 4 so that there's a nice continuum and that they're building upon what they know, and there's not a big knowledge gap between what they know coming into a class and where we actually start the class. So you want it kind of matched up. And that's far easier to do with a single student, but whenever you've got a classroom of 20, 40, 60 or more students, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge. So I've shared this principle with faculty in the past, and they say, well, how do you find out what your students know, especially in aggregate like that? And I say, well, you should just ask them. In fact, every class I've taught for the last probably 15 or plus years, I give a pre-semester survey. And in the survey, I ask them attitudinal questions about the course and find out, if I'm using specific technologies within the class, I want to make sure that my students have some competency with those technologies. But I also ask typically 20 sort of test questions, if you will. I ask 10 questions specifically that ask content questions for things that I'm assuming they already know coming into my class. So I don't plan on covering this in my class, but I think they would already know this before they come to my class. So that's what I'm assuming regarding their prior knowledge. I also ask 10 questions that are from content from the first 2 or 3 weeks of the term. And that lets me see, am I shooting too low for my students? In other words, am I expecting that they only know this, but they're actually far more advanced? And so that gives me a real opportunity to change my instruction in an interesting way. If I find that a group of students is further behind, then maybe I do some recitation sessions or point them to some online resources to try to help them catch up so that they just don't start out far behind and never catch up. Or if I find that they're more advanced than I had anticipated, well, then maybe I change what I was going to do those first 2 or 3 weeks, maybe provide a lot more case-based or applied questions or models for us to kind of explore. But I feel like, if I can kind of make some changes in the first 2 to 3 weeks of a term and kind of try to norm my students into the intellectual life of the course. I really can't change the entire course. If my students were all very far behind, I would need to see if I can figure out strategies to kind of bring them forward. But, trying to find out what my students know and then teaching accordingly provides me with an opportunity to see if I can help as many students as possible in my class succeed. So that's the first principle. Find out what your students know and teach accordingly. Something else that we know about learning is that if we provide students with opportunities to do things, to do a performance, to do a test or whatever it might be, and if they receive feedback on the tasks that they're performing, especially immediate feedback, that's exceptionally important to the learning process. Of course, providing immediate feedback is often difficult because, we take up tests or we take up writing assignments, and then we need a little bit of time to do some grading before we can get them back to students. So I have a couple of pieces of advice there. One is not all feedback has to come from us. So we could have students bring a problem set in and they could share and then discuss, and so they're getting feedback from their peers. We can also give feedback, of course, in class, maybe as a closing activity for students doing this kind of peer feedback to one another. One thing that I've found, though, is whenever I would turn back papers and tests to my students, even if I've given a lot of feedback on them, I would find that giving back papers was a two-step process. I'd hand back papers. The first thing students would do would be that they would look for the grade. And then the second thing they would do is they would put it in their backpack. They'd put it away. And it was frustrating to me because I really wish that they would spend some time looking at the feedback. So what I started to do a few years back was I would hand back papers with all of my feedback, but then I would not put a grade on the paper or the test. And of course, students would always raise their hands and say, Professor Watson, you forgot to put a grade on my paper. And I would say, well, tonight in the learning management system, our online grade book at 8 o'clock, the grade for this test will appear. But between now and then, maybe right now while I'm getting ready for class, read over my comments and then maybe in pencil write the grade you think you earned on that paper based on my comments. I found that all students then will very much engage with my feedback. They didn't necessarily like that strategy, but they definitely did or will engage with the feedback, and they'll get their grade that night. And I've also found that sometimes students who maybe got a lower grade than they anticipated, who may have been frustrated, they've had an opportunity to reflect on my feedback and on their performance before they come and chat with me about any questions they might have about the grade. So there's lots of benefits to this particular strategy, but indeed we know that providing opportunities for students to do things, to perform, and then to get immediate feedback is essential for the learning process. Something else that we know about learning is that social interaction is really important for the learning process. So having opportunities for students to work in teams, or to debate ideas, or to work on projects together. In fact, there's several sets of literature that focus on the value of social interaction. There's collaborative learning and cooperative learning and team-based learning, peer-to-peer learning. There's lots of different language for it out there, but basically the educational psychology foundation for social learning is based on Lev Vygotsky's work, and there's this notion of zone of proximal development. And Vygotsky argued that any of us working by ourselves could achieve up to a certain level. But if we're working with someone else or in a team, the final product would be quite a bit better, just because you would have more ideas at play. And so he called this zone the zone of proximal development. By working together, students can actually learn more and do better. And there have been, just hundreds and hundreds of studies that have played that out, showing that students indeed learn more through social interaction. Of course, sometimes students don't like to work in teams, depending on how projects will be graded, but there's a whole set of literature on strategies for grading group projects and how students can have voice in that process. So again, huge sets of literatures out there regarding social interaction and how to leverage it well in classes. Something else that we also know, really a lot of research within the last 15 years coming out of a number of different places, including Washington University in St. Louis, is the value or importance of the act, excuse me, of the act of recall to learning. So students bringing things out of their brain rather than just sort of reading their notes and trying to stuff things into the brain is far more effective. And learning is actually a very physical thing. Like, brain structures change as we learn things, and so we know that if we bring forth something in our mind that we had learned recently, it strengthens those neural pathways. It increases the persistence of that memory or that learning. In fact, there's a professor at Washington University, Henry Roediger, who has sort of made a career in doing research regarding the value of recall. And he has provided a number of strategies, teaching strategies as well as study strategies for students. For instance, one of the strategies that you see students use quite a bit for learning and for studying for tests is to just kind of read over their notes, maybe multiple times, just kind of reading over it. That's a fairly ineffective strategy for learning or for studying for a test. However, making note cards and writing questions on the front of the note card and having the answer on the back, to cover the material where you're asking yourself a question, you have to bring forth that knowledge that strengthens those neural pathways. But then going through a stack of cards that students themselves have created, they can quickly see what they don't know and what they do know. So they become far more efficient at studying. If they go through a stack of cards and they got 20 out of 30 right, well, the 20 they got correct, they don't need to study that anymore or as much. They can then focus on the area where they have realized that they're not necessarily as knowledgeable in. So certainly study strategies, but there's also ramifications for how we teach. Indeed, given the compelling nature of the recall literature, we probably should be giving cumulative tests and probably providing frequent quizzes to our students, just lots of opportunities for recall. But there's lots of ways to do that as well that are kind of lower stakes. Maybe when students leave class, they write down on a note card, we call them exit tickets, that you don't leave class until you've written down 3 things that you learned in class today, or 3 questions that you have regarding today's class, but again, it's just another act of recall. Writing is a good act of recall. There's lots of good strategies that we know promote learning through the act of recall. So before joining AAC&U, I was at the University of Georgia, and we had Henry Roediger come and speak about his research on recall at the university. And when he was there, he did a very compelling talk, and we had a dinner afterwards. And one of the faculty members at the dinner said, "Wow, this is really compelling. I'm really going to change some of the structures in my class. Would you say that recall is the most important thing for learning?" And he kind of paused and looked into the distance, and he said, "Most important thing for learning? No, the most important thing for learning is exercise." And indeed, this is sort of an aside at the moment, but indeed, the most valuable things for learning are things that we have no control of within our classrooms for the most part. We know that sleep is very important for memory and retention. We know that having water is really, really important. Diet and exercise are really, really key to the learning process. Time on task is indeed something else that's really important for learning. So me and my colleague, Jose Bowen, we came up with sort of this acronym. Learning is sweet, we describe it. But again, these are things that are sort of outside of our teaching practice for the most part, but it's definitely important to let students know that getting your heart rate up every day will actually help you remember what took place in class, will help you synthesize memories by having a good night's sleep, those kinds of things. So these are other things that we can use to advise our students. Ultimately, I guess the bottom line behavior that we're looking at within all of learning is this notion of cognitive processing, where anytime that we have our students grapple with ideas, defend an argument, write, whenever they're sort of being forced to work with the material in the class, that's when learning is going to take place. And there's a lot of narrative regarding active learning versus passive learning and sort of along the higher education landscape. And for me, that's the bottom line difference is if you have a teaching strategy that's requiring students to grapple with something, all students within a class, then that's going to be a really high impact, deep learning teaching strategy. If it's a strategy where students are just sort of taking notes or they can sort of not, there's no expectation that they're going to engage in that particular class, then there's not necessarily a lot of learning that's taking place at that moment. They might be capturing notes and they'll study them later, but it sort of misses an opportunity for within the individual class. So that's really sort of the foundation for flipping the classroom as a model, which I'll get to here in just a second, but I want to highlight one study. It's about a 20-year-old study at this point, performed by Richard Haig. He's a physics professor looking at physics students. And it's a complicated graph here, but you'll notice that at the bottom, there are shaded in boxes along the graph, and then there's sort of some non-shaded in boxes. And basically a shaded in box is a passive learning teaching strategy that was used. The shape of the box is for high school students or four-year institutions or big R1 institutions. I think of the over 6,000 students part of this study, I think 2/3 of them were from big R1 universities, so research institutions. And so the graph itself is showing learning gains. So they did a pre-test at the beginning of a class and then did a quiz at the end of the class and to see how much learning took place within the class. And so you can see students might start out with, maybe a 40% on the test or 60% on the test because they haven't been taught the material yet. And then how high on the graph is how much learning took place from between the pre and the post test. I hope I'm explaining that well. But basically what you'll see on the graph is that sometimes people will exaggerate and say that students just don't learn from lecturing, and that's not the case. Students will indeed learn from lectures, but it appears that maybe the best lectures only result in as much learning as maybe the least effective interactive engagement strategy. So active learning, and this is just one of many, many studies that have shown this, that active learning strategies tend to produce more learning within the classroom than, say, a lecture-based model. So in sort of summarizing the literature today on teaching and learning, I guess we kind of come up with a solid basic formula regarding what we know about learning and how we should teach. So, regardless of the discipline, of course, the learning outcome would drive the specific strategy, what you want your students to be able to do. But generally speaking, you want to build instruction based on what we know about how students learn. So human cognition, attention spans, things like that, that should be a key piece of what we build into our foundations for our instruction. But we also want to build upon prior knowledge. We want to leverage social learning opportunities, provide opportunities for students to do things and to get feedback, especially immediate feedback. Provide opportunities for students to sort of pull things out of their brain. So writing, taking tests. In fact, every test that we give is indeed an act of pedagogy. Students tend to remember what was on the test more so than what they studied. So anytime that we provide a test, we're fostering recall and we're improving learning. And so really that bottom line behavior then is to promote processing in all that we do. And that's really the foundation for the flipping the classroom model. And that's why it has, I guess, such excitement and so much narrative regarding flipping the classroom these days, is because it is very much built upon what we know about how humans learn. So let me sort of unpack the flipping the classroom model in a little bit more depth with some specificity, and then I'm happy to take some questions. So again, I guess the bottom line behavior is what we process, we learn. So anytime we have students engaging and struggling with content, grappling with content, defending an argument, working in teams, anytime that they're processing, they're going to learn, and really flipping then leverages that knowledge regarding cognitive processing and what we know about learning. So essentially, if the elevator speech for what is flipping the classroom, I would say it's a set of instructional approaches that kind of looks at the lifespan of what a student might be doing in a particular week and looks to maximize engagement before, during, and after class. So again, it's about sort of increasing cognitive processing. It's about increasing student engagement. Maybe a generalized flipping the classroom model is that you sort of intentionally think about what students are going to do outside of the class, and maybe it's a first exposure to new content within the class. And then how it's flipped is that class time then is not really used for lecturing all that much anymore. It's actually used for processing, where students are doing problem sets, or they're involved in analysis, or they're doing content synthesizing types of activities. So class becomes far more active, and we think about what we're doing outside of class far more intentionally. So maybe breaking that model down a little bit more, we think about what we have our students do before class, and then we have students do something before they come to class so that we have a better sense of what they know. And ideally, they would get feedback on those assessments. So, if you're using technology for like an online quiz, quizzing systems, most modern quizzing systems and learning management systems can provide feedback as a part of that process. Of course, feedback can be at the beginning of class too. Maybe they bring a little paragraph in, or they do some problems and they get feedback from their peers, or we share what the correct answer is before we move forward with what we would do in class. And then in class is usually a more active classroom with students actually doing things, working problems, like I said, and then receiving feedback on the work that they're doing within class. And then, of course, there's additional opportunities for student learning, of course, when they're studying for the test. And so providing them with some study strategies, such as using note cards and the like as one way to approach studying is one model. Of course, we know the test itself is a act of pedagogy. And then, of course, there's feedback on the test. So, maybe the previous model of teaching and learning was, well, we would think about what we would do in class, and then there's going to be a test, not necessarily thinking about all of the pieces and what might we do different, what might we do differently to maximize processing at all of those points when students would be engaging with content. So that's really what flipping the classroom is sort of thinking about how do we maximize processing at each of these particular points in the process. As I've sort of advised faculty in higher education and observed some classes, sometimes I'll see faculty using flipping the classroom and maybe recording lectures or making a podcast to put audio files online for students to be able to listen to and to have first exposure to content before they come to class. But sometimes faculty don't relinquish what they were doing in the classroom and changing that to actually being far more sort of guide on the side, having students do problems and then you wander around the classroom and help students who might get stuck. So flipping doesn't mean twice the lecturing, in class and out of class. It really means an entirely different way to approach doing what you're considering doing in class. So with that said, there are some challenges to flipping the classroom. Some faculty have noted that students aren't necessarily doing the readings or other pre-class activities before they come to class, so they come to class unprepared. And if you sort of have things scheduled for your class time with your students based upon the assumption that they've engaged with the content to a certain extent and they haven't, then a flipped classroom class can be quite a bit of a disaster when just no one's prepared to do the work, and so they just struggle. They're just, again, it's sort of that notion of prior knowledge. They come in not being prepared for class, and then we've got them set up for high engagement, and they're just not ready to do that. So the question that you might ask yourself, are students more likely to watch videos than read? And as we push more and more content outside of class, is it reasonable to think that they'll watch videos or do more reading or listen to TED Talks or whatever it might be that we would provide them? And so probably the answer is no, it probably isn't necessarily reasonable to think that students would do those activities, but are there things that we might do then as we structure our instruction to help motivate students to do that work? And indeed, I think that there are ways to make this model work well for students. So I've kind of broken down the flipping model into sort of like 3 sub-questions that faculty should ask as they consider their flipping the classroom approach. And one is, what will you give your students outside of class to do? So what are those outside of class activities or assignments? And then maybe the key question, and this is the question that maybe some faculty don't include in their model, but how do you motivate your students to engage with those activities? So you're giving them maybe more work outside of class. How do you actually get them to do that work? And then assuming that you've now pushed some of the lecture content or the introduction to content outside of the classroom, what do you do with that reclaimed class time? So we'll talk about these 3 questions briefly here. So the first is, what are some of the out-of-class activities that you might give students? I think we've given reading assignments for centuries in higher education, so certainly that's still a valid and viable out-of-class activity or pre-class activity. Maybe the readings are coupled with additional forms of guidance. So, when you read this chapter, come to class with the 3 most important points from the chapter, or so I've assigned this to you. Why do you think I'm having you read this this particular essay in this engineering class or whatever it might be? So just think about how you might make the reading assignment be a little bit more active and engaging. But there's lots of other ways to provide first exposure to content. There's so much podcast content that you might be able to find something already out there rather than having to make it yourself. But we could certainly make our own podcasts or our own videos, our own lecture content. We might also have our students attend an event on campus, a lecture, or go to a specific location with an assignment. Like if you're teaching an architecture class, you might send them to a specific place in your city and ask them to spend some time reflecting on a particular building, for instance, with some guiding questions. But these are different ways that you can provide first exposure to the content. Then now maybe to the more challenging question is, well, how do I motivate my students to engage with those out-of-class activities? So even though you've maybe given them a little bit more homework to do, how can you ensure that they're engaging? And I think the bottom line answer to that question is this notion of quizzing, is the notion of providing assessments that require the students to actually work with or complete those out-of-class assignments. So whenever there's a point value attached to something, even if it's a very small point value, students are more likely to engage with the work that would lead them to do well on that quiz or that assessment than if it was just a homework assignment that you're going to talk about or work with in class. That adding that little extra bit of incentive or motivation is indeed a key way to get students to engage. Of course, quizzing is often seen as sort of a low level, sort of just memorization, a way to test for memorization or just understanding or comprehension, not necessarily a way to kind of push them up to more advanced forms of learning. But I think that there are really interesting ways to write quiz questions, for instance, that can sort of push students into this domain of being challenged and engage more in cognitive processing. So as some examples, a question like, of the 4 answers below, so this would be a multiple choice question, of the 4 answers below, all of which are true, which methodology would be the best to employ in whatever the case might be? So you're actually asking students to evaluate really 4 different methodologies, and in this specific case, decide which would be the best one to use. That's sort of a real world example of what students might be doing post-graduation. So that's a very good thorny, difficult question to ask students that require a lot of engagement. You can also ask questions like, what principle is the order of the following information based upon? So fill in the blank, but then there's this ordering, so they would have to then pull out models that they've worked with previously. So you can do some really interesting things with quizzing that can kind of move students, higher on something called Bloom's taxonomy, sort of like different levels of learning. That's really, really valuable for the learning process. And of course, you might have your students, rather than a multiple choice quiz as a pre-class assessment, maybe they're asked to write a 25-word summary. Okay, so you read this, what was the most important key point of the essay or the article? What should you have gotten out of it and be able to bring to class? So write that down, and then you could begin class with a 5-minute activity where they compare their 25-word summaries with a peer in class and they discuss a bit, and then you can certainly provide sort of the correct answer, if you will, regarding why they should have been reviewing that particular content. So anyways, lots of ways to kind of make sure that students do stuff before they come to class. And again, if you gave them a 25-word summary, maybe they compare in class with a peer, but then you take those up, and of course, you could put a grade on them, and those are very quick and easy to grade, a 25-word summary, and maybe it's just a completion grade since they actually discussed it during class. But again, having students do something that's dependent upon the out-of-class content is key to a successful flipped classroom. So I was just talking about micro writing assignments, the 25-word summary. So what do you do then with the reclaimed class time? If students have kind of gotten an overview of the content and they've actually done some low-level problem solving with that content, what do you do differently with your reclaimed class time? And what you see pictured here is a picture of, we have a number of different classroom sort of structure models. I'm sure you have these in your nation as well, where you have students working together on teams and solving problems. And that's really sort of the larger idea is with the reclaimed class time, you have students working together on real world problems. And active learning, again, is sort of the phrase that's often referred to regarding this sort of cognitive processing notion of reclaimed class time. And there's lots of different strategies out there. Almost each one of these could be its own hour-long presentation, but you could have students come to class with those 25-word summaries like I was just speaking about. So entry points into class. You could have students actually write during class or build concept maps, or of course discussion is a very common teaching strategy. Think, Pair, Share is maybe the most oft used active learning strategy, where you have students you present a problem, you have them think about it, maybe draft their own answer to it, then you have students pair up and they compare their answers and talk a little bit more, and then there's a larger class discussion to make sure everyone got to the answer. This is problem-based learning, case-based learning, experiential learning, service learning out in the community, There's lots of technologies that you could use in an active learning classroom, such as clickers that can help as well. Eric Mazur at MIT has some very engaging, interesting research regarding the use of clickers. So I will say, while you look at all of these active learning strategies, each of them has its own literature base, its scholarly foundation, has its own set of best practices. So none of these in and of themselves are, sort of silver bullets or magic bullets regarding active learning, but there's sort of ways to do each of these well that we should explore as we think about trying these in our own classes. So my key recommendations then for flipping the classroom is do start small, maybe in a semester. Consider flipping 3 or 4 classes in a semester rather than trying to take maybe what was previously, excuse me, a lecture-based class. Rather than taking what was previously a lecture-based class and turning it into a flipped classroom, maybe look at your semester, see which content might lend itself to a flipped model where there's a lot of opportunity for students to grapple with or work on problem sets or whatever it might be during the class. And then, if you do find that flipping the classroom kind of matches your teaching persona and you are seeing the learning gains that you were hoping would be produced by flipping the classroom, probably through a set of iterations over a few semesters, maybe 2 or 3 semesters, you could move a class to being almost entirely flipped. But I have seen faculty who get really excited about a presentation like this and they decide that next semester they're going to really change everything, and then they do, and just because it's so much change and they're getting comfortable using that model themselves, it's been a little bit of a challenge. So I definitely suggest starting small, maybe think about flipping. If you're someone who's done predominantly lecturing, maybe flip 1 class every other week or something like that the first time through, and sort of develop some competency and comfort with the model before you try to take the whole class in that direction. So with that said, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have regarding flipping the classroom or anything else you'd like for me to talk in greater depth about.
Okay, so open now for questions or comments. Go ahead.
Could you spell out some cognitive processes that would really engage students?
Yes, so AAC&U, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, we have a set of high impact practices that we promote for deepening learning. In fact, our high impact practices, the research on all 11 has shown not only do they deepen learning, in other words, really engage students cognitively, they actually tend to show that it helps students persist in college and complete more quickly. So among those strategies are some are classroom-based strategies and some are larger sort of maybe institutional models, but classroom-based strategies, maybe 2 of the most effective are indeed having students write. It's hard not to be cognitively engaged whenever you're writing or you're typing. You can't sort of skip out on that learning activity. You have to write. Also, working in teams, having students chat with one another, that proves to be a fantastic way for students to be engaged cognitively. Also, hands-on activities. So what's sometimes referred to as experiential learning, but having students, if it's a biology classroom, having students, hands-on dissect a frog, or a chemistry classroom, or a biology classroom, I guess still too, using a microscope, looking at things and maybe writing in a journal regarding what they're seeing. I think anytime that we kind of move away from lecturing and have students doing things hands-on, you're going to see that they're far more cognitively engaged. But there are a lot of larger models too, like first-year experiences that kind of have all of these elements maybe embedded within them. Study abroad is shown to be a very effective learning strategy. The use of electronic portfolios where students might collect their work over time And then at some point there would be an assignment within a class where students would have to go back in and look at the items in their portfolio and maybe describe, reflect upon, make meaning of how these things fit together. So you took a engineering class and you took a philosophy class. How are those two courses in conversation with one another? Because they indeed are, and often, our curriculum are sometimes very siloed, and so students don't see that how these are actually all speaking to maybe the same topic. So that's a short answer, I guess, to a very good question regarding how to foster cognitive processing with students.
Go ahead. Okay, Dr. Oji, go ahead.
Hello, Edward. How are you?
Hello, I'm well. How about you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for the talk. It was great.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, I've never done flipped classrooms, but I was thinking that, or I'm guessing that some students would probably benefit from flipped classrooms more than others or so. Which ones would you think that would, which class of students would benefit more? Are you talking about high achievers, low achievers, or let's say students who are in the middle? Is there any study?
Yes, there are. There are studies. There's the research shows that actually students who start further behind are able to sort of help close some of the achievement gaps by engaging in set strategies. That those that are sort of maybe not as well prepared for college it helps sort of bring them up and catch them up to the students that are better prepared. So really flipping, I guess one of the reasons why it is so widely promoted is it does tend to have benefits for all students. All students do really, really well with the flipped model. The interesting notion, though, is less about students' preparedness for college, for instance, or for a particular course. The interesting challenge is sometimes students have a learning preference. And often the students that come to university got to university because they were really good at listening to lectures and kind of figured out the puzzle that was their secondary high school experience. And so they find flipping the classroom to be sort of a foreign experience, something that they're not necessarily comfortable with right off the bat. We often hear in the States, just tell me what you want me to know. Just tell me what you want me to know, and I'll memorize it, and then I'll give it back to you on a test. And while they've been really good at that, it's not necessarily from a learning perspective. If the goal is to have students know how to do things, to remember things well beyond the course, then active learning strategies, flipping the classroom, is indeed a model that we would want to go with. I guess one of the most unfortunate things about sort of how the human brain works is that the students that cram for a test the night before, that's actually very effective at doing well on a test. It's not effective at remembering things for the long term. So, if you study the night before till 3 a.m. or whatever it is, and you get up and you go take the test, you might do well on that test, get a high mark on that test. But if you took the same test a week later, your performance would be quite poor. Just the decay of that kind of studying and memory is great. So if the real goal is that, you want a student who 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years after your class still remembers that class content, then active learning strategies that promote cognitive processing are indeed our best model going forward. That's really the key reason why I'm so excited about flipping the classroom, is that research shows it's so persistent for learning and memory.
Thank you so much. May I have a follow-up question, please?
Please do.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Would you say that students have to be willing to participate in the flipped classroom to be able to get the benefit, or would forcing the students to do the to attend or to register in a flipped classroom would also give them the benefit? I mean, would you need the students to be willing to participate themselves?
I think so, but there's a way to achieve that goal. So I think I mean, whenever I do the flipped classroom, recognizing that there may be some resistance from some students, I typically will spend maybe 10 minutes sort of highlighting, not in great detail or in technical depth, but I'll highlight the educational research regarding flipping the classroom. I'll say, okay, hey, you may not have had a class like this before, but here's what the most current research regarding student learning says. And we know that if we do this, this, and this, students are more likely to remember stuff. And my aspirations for you as my class of students is to be able to have this content with you whenever you're my age. I want you to remember this stuff, well beyond your time in college. And I know that I often will share the experience where I was looking at my college transcript. This may have been 5 years ago, and I saw courses that I took during my freshman year in college that I have no memory of, that I had no recollection that I took that particular, philosophy class. But clearly I went to it for 4 months, but I didn't remember it. And so my goal, this is what I'll say to my students, my goal is for you to remember this class, to remember this content well into your career arc. And so because of that, because of what I know regarding learning, I'm really excited to try some new things with this class. And while you may find it, a little disorienting or challenging or difficult, you're going to find that the learning rewards are exceptionally great. So, I try to get really excited and show my excitement to the students and explain why I'm doing something. And students will go along with me. If they understand that I'm doing something because I care about their learning, I find that resistance evaporates. But if I just sort of jump in and it's like, okay, I'm going to give you more homework and you're going to be doing problems in class, students will just sometimes feel overwhelmed by it and not really know why we're doing things in this new way when they were so comfortable with the old lecture and study and, regurgitate for the test.
Oh, thank you, Professor Edward, for the nice presentation. I missed actually the first 5 minutes, and maybe that's the reason why I don't get the name of flipping. It looks like flipping because it's based on the pre-class assignment, that you give assignment to students so that they learn out of it, and then they come to the class for interaction, if that's the case.
That's exactly
anyway,
it.
My question will be, okay, you can clarify it, but the question will be, what will be the key performance indicators that can be used to measure flipping success?
I think there are a number of things. We often will teach a class, for multiple semesters, and so we can kind of get a sense from previous semesters, has student performance within like a specific class been fairly consistent? Like, am I finding that the end of course average is a 78 or an 83, just sort of historically, semester after semester, students are doing, wow, just about the same. And so then if I try new instructional strategies, am I seeing end of course grades improving? Am I seeing end of course grades going in the opposite direction? Maybe they're not improving, they're becoming poor. But that's one way to kind of get a sense of how well are my students doing. Another way might be to look at specific projects within a class. Do I have is there a specific set of weeks where, geez, my students always struggle with these ideas, and no matter how I lecture or what I say or what metaphors I use or what images I share on my PowerPoint slides, students just always struggle with these ideas. It might be that you take a look at that one assignment where your students typically struggle, and then see if they do better in a flip term or under a flip model than how they were doing previously. You might also ask some attitudinal questions. Survey your students and ask them their perceptions of flipping the classroom. Invariably, we're asking more of our students. We're asking them to engage more. So they're going to definitely see it as more work. But you might ask, do you feel that you're learning more under this model than maybe you have in other classes that have been mostly lecture? Like, do you feel like you could do this concept or idea or model in the real world? Like, if you're in an engineering class where you're learning stuff in a professional degree program that you should be applying or doing in the real world, after you complete a set of content, they do the project or they take the exam, asking, do you feel that you can indeed now do this in the real world? Or do you feel still like you're not confident in your ability to do that. So some self-efficacy questions might be something to ask students, attitudinal questions, self-efficacy questions, but also ask them, or just look at their grades on specific parts of the course or the end of course term grade if you've decided to flip the entirety of a classroom.
Yeah, my last question is about some topics like science especially. Then we'll be deprived from lots of methods that will be used by flipping, for example, external visits, case studies, and things like that. They don't exist for science. So basically, will be based on reading assignments and things related to that to encourage the flipping and the interaction. My last question will be the following: the student use the so-called minimal path principle to ensure that they get good grades, because at the end they want good grades. And this of course approach defeats the flipping, because the flipping encourages the learning, and the learning process is not automatically related to the grading. So how to resolve this issue using the flipping approach? That is, using the flipping, ensuring that student gets better grades, because that's the so-called key performance indicator for them.
Yes. So I think one thing that faculty can adopt as part of their course redesign strategy to ensure that flipping produces the learning outcomes that you're hoping for is there's this notion of instructional alignment, where you articulate exactly what it is you want your students to learn. And so that's the target. You do that first before you design any of the instruction. I want my students to know how to do these 5 things, whatever they might be. And so then you might ask yourself, okay, if I want them to know these 5 things, how will I assess that they know these 5 things? So is it a project? Is it an exam? And maybe go ahead and make the assessment. So before you even get to the point of designing the instruction, you work on what are the learning outcomes, what's the assessment that would show measurement of achievement of those learning outcomes. So you kind of have the front end and the end of the process, the assessment. Then you start to build instruction thinking, okay, what could I provide my students that would enable them to do that assessment and show evidence of achievement of those learning outcomes? And so that then provides kind of the framework within which you would build your flipped instruction, is trying to still stay close to the goals of learning. Because indeed, you're correct, students are often in a model of trying to pursue, and who can blame them? The reward system within a course is really the course grades, the grades that you're going to earn. So students are always trying to figure out, how can I do the most, well, actually, students are just trying to figure out how to get the good grade in the class. And often is, how can I do the least amount of work to get the highest grade in the classroom? So I think using specific strategies, instructional design strategies that help you keep the focus on learning can really help provide a framework within which students are working that can help them, even though they're focused on trying to get a good grade, by working through the instruction that you've set up, it's almost by default they're going to learn regardless of the grade that they get. Instructional alignment is the key concept there. Yeah.
Dr. Ahmed Fathi, it's your turn.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, Edward? Thank you for the nice presentation. Although I missed the first few minutes, I would like to ask for a PDF copy of your presentation, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide my slides, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Our question is about introducing an honors program at KFUBM. We are about to start the honors program at KFUBM next fall, and we are in the process of developing our faculty members and designing the courses. My question is, how popular is the flipping classroom in the honors program, as far as you know, in the honors programs and honors colleges at the United States?
It's interesting. I doubt that they would call it honors programs, but certainly within the states, you really see honors programs as being built almost entirely within an active learning model where there's not a lot of lecturing. You have students, I used to teach in the honors program at Virginia Tech, and I had students do a lot of work outside of class, and then when they came to class, typically I would come in with I want to make sure that I've covered these 5 or 6 concepts, but it's usually through a matter of dialogue. It was a humanities course that I was teaching at that particular time for the Honors College. But yeah, the signature pedagogy of honors colleges typically does not involve much lecturing at all. And so I doubt that they would say, well, we're flipping the classroom, but historically that's what they've always been doing. They have students engage in something outside of class, and when they come to class, it's very much a dialogue, it's very much discussion, it's very much working on concepts and problems and the like. You rarely see an honors, generally you find honors classes are typically much smaller than maybe other university classes, which lends itself to easier classroom management around active learning. But you rarely see, like my honors class were typically 12 to 15 students, which was just wonderful. It was like teaching a graduate seminar. And I don't think I ever used PowerPoint slides in there. Just the students, it's a different level of engagement with honors students anyways, and they typically come to class having engaged with whatever assignment was outside of class. And, you can just have great discussions, rich progress around learning goals. I found that I needed for myself to have this little note card of these are the things I want to make sure that we kind of cover in class, because the discussions were typically so rich, it would be easy to sort of go and follow their digressions. And again, I needed to make sure that I've got my learning outcomes identified and what I want to accomplish within that class to kind of hold it within sort of the framework of the class. But honors colleges, it's typically very much an active learning model anyways.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Yahya Assis.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
So my question, on one of the slides, flipping the classroom was defined as maximizing information processing. So this is new to me and very appealing, in fact. So what does the literature tell us about the best practices in the classroom that foster maximizing information, especially in log sessions that can go beyond 1 hour?
If I understand the question, there is, it is very true. Flipping the classroom is not, it's not going to magically work and ensure that all students learn. There's definitely sort of when done well regarding, any instructional strategy. I think that there are some active learning or flipped classrooms that will be fantastic and others that might not go that well. Just depending on the strategies that are being employed as part of the active learning strategy. But I think, whenever I talk to faculty and they ask me, hey, I'm thinking about trying this in the classroom, I always sort of think, okay, so what's the student actually doing in their mind? Are they required to grapple with something? Are they working a problem set in class? Are they discussing ideas with another student in class? Are they having to write as part of the activity? If students are being required to be engaged, that's likely to be a highly efficacious learning strategy. If students can kind of opt out, so a lecture, students don't necessarily have to be all that engaged. They just need to kind of be a stenographer. Doing an experiment in the front of the classroom, which should be interesting. The truth is, students could opt out of sort of really engaging or watching that or reflecting upon that activity. I know in the States, a lot of faculty will show TED Talks as part of a class. Here's a 15-minute lecture essentially. Again, students could easily opt out of that. I could kind of go on and on about strategies where you can see how students don't necessarily have to engage. But if you plan something for your class that pretty much all students would have to be grappling with the content, then you've probably got something that's going to be working to, number one, you're working cognitive processing, you're definitely having them engaging. And if you've got something structured well, then it's indeed going to improve learning or increase learning in the direction that you've got the assignment designed for. So thinking about specific strategies, I mean, I find, so I used to teach statistics classes, graduate level statistics classes, and I would give problem sets for homework that were typically sort of like easier examples of like the concepts that we're looking at. So in other words, I wanted the students to be able to kind of understand the process of doing this problem, but I didn't give them the really hard problem for homework. So they'd come to class and they feel like, okay, I've got a baseline knowledge. I did these 15 math problems. I did well on them. And so when they come to class, I then give them the really complicated one, or the use cases that they haven't, you know, that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate, that would require a little bit more thinking. I guess my perspective always was that I want my students to struggle and even fail. I want them to struggle and fail when I'm there with them. You know, I want the student who gets to a point and they're like, I don't know how to solve this problem. I want to be able to come over to them and say, well, let me help you. So what have you thought about so far? What was your strategy approaching here? You know, I think the last place I want my students to struggle and fail is like at 2 a.m. when there's no one that can help them, and maybe they end up trying to go on a search engine to find an answer or whatever. And so it's sort of like a very, you know, meandering path to try to get to learning. But I see class time as when I give them the thorny problems, and then whenever they struggle, then I'm there to answer the questions that they have. I feel like I can help propel their learning with minimal frustration, rather than giving them the hard problems to work on at night and when they're by themselves and they often maybe can't find their way to the solution. So I feel like it's a teachable moment. I'm right there with them. I can help push them to get the right answer or figure out how to do the problem.
One quick question, if you don't mind. So, do you classify the case method that is? It's a quick question, Doctor. The case method in the business school.
There are a couple of guys waiting here.
Yeah. Do you classify it as a way to? Do you classify it as a way of flipping the classroom? The case method.
Oh yes, absolutely. Using case-based models, you know, where you have you know, your students come into class, you give them a case that they're working for, they've got to come up with the best solution or to unpack what went wrong in this situation. Case-based learning is a fantastic active learning, high cognitive engagement strategy, assuming that you have it structured where each student is indeed grappling with the case. So I think pair-share model is great as a companion to a case study. So you might hand out a case study and say, okay, each of you take the next 5 minutes, read it, and then write down 2 or 3 things that you see this particular professional did wrong in this particular case. So each student is having to think a little bit, and it kind of prepares them to be in a discussion. And then you kind of move them to maybe a small group where they then grapple with the case base, the case model, and then you move to a larger discussion. But yeah, think pair share coupled with case, fantastic high engagement instructional strategy.
Okay, Dr. Mancosa, it's your turn now.
Okay, thank you. I have to be very quick. I know I'm coming at the end of the event. Actually, I do practice flipped classrooms, so I just want your feedback on 2 little issues just for benchmarking. In the case where you do recording for the pre-class, your own recording for the pre-class material, what is a usual, or I mean, sort of usual length of recording that is equivalent to a 50 minutes class? B, do you flip, is it usual to flip the whole course, or you flip, you know, some selected classes? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the second question first. I wouldn't recommend that you flip the whole class to start with. And, you know, in truth, some content doesn't lend itself terribly well to be flipped. So sometimes you can't come up with a good, you know, strategy for what's, you know, is there an alternative way to do this in a flipped model, or is this really just content? You know, how do I, you know, in fact, the research shows that maybe the best class model is one that begins with maybe 10 or 15 minutes of lecturing that sets the stage for students to do something in the class, and then it concludes with another sort of, you know, 3 or 4 minutes of lectures. Like, okay, you grappled with this case for the last 20 minutes. We've talked about it. Here's really what how professionals have seen this as the best way to approach this particular case. So you know, lecturing has its place in any class, and I definitely think if you've got a class that's been mostly lecturing, and then you transition it to a flipped model, something you probably want to do over the span of 2 or 3 semesters rather than trying to flip the whole thing. You know, just in all classes, there's some high points like, oh, this is something I could easily have my students work on. There's problems associated with this, or there's concepts that we could work with, or there's cases that are exemplars within the field around this particular topic. So I would move more slowly. And I'm afraid your first question escapes me. Could you restate that one for me?
Yes, you know, for example, you go to lecture for 50 minutes. You know, you really, I mean, when you lecture, you have interaction with students. You probably repeat some statements. You emphasize a few things. When you do recording offline, so that students can listen to the recording before they come, you don't need to do all of this. So eventually, I would assume that a recording equivalent to a 50-minute material in class would be much less than this. Is this true?
I think that when you just sort of think about the lecture and you think about the interruptions that you have during the time, there certainly would be a compression of the time. But what might actually be a better indicator of length would be what we know about human attention spans. And there's research from the 70s and forward that have shown that human attention spans tend to have, I'm not going to call it a limit, but there tends to be sort of a decay after about, you know, around 15 minutes, give or take. And it's not that, you know, 15 minutes into something you really can't focus any longer. It's just that you tend to become more and more distracted, or more difficult to focus whenever you're just sort of listening to a lecture. So, you know, the recommendation might be that you maybe chunk your lecture. Like if you had a 50-minute lecture that really, without the interruptions, it's maybe a 40-minute lecture. Maybe do 2 separate, if you can find a logical break point, have 2 different lectures, like one that's maybe 15 or 20 minutes in length max, and then, you know, give students an opportunity to break, or you have them do something like, okay, after you watch this lecture, summarize key points and then watch part 2 of this lecture. But I mean, in fact, if you've noticed, TED Talks are typically no longer than about 18 minutes, and it's based on the knowledge of what we know about human attention spans. And again, it's not that human attention spans end, it's that there's just this decay that kind of begins. It just becomes more difficult to focus. But you can reset attention spans by breaking up a regular lecture. I used to teach the 3-hour evening classes in statistics, and you know, I would lecture for 20 minutes and then we would do some problems, and then I would lecture for 15 minutes and we would do a case, and then we'd take a break, and then I would lecture again. So I was doing quite a bit of lecturing, but I was breaking it up, sort of embracing what we know about human attention, and just trying to design instruction in a way that would be most effective for student learning.
There's another one. Okay, this is from Dr. Muhammad Antar. He's saying flipping classrooms may work well with some students and not with others. How to motivate them to do pre-class if a big portion do not read? It may fail this trial.
Yeah, I
so
think that
he's talking about, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that is the key crux for flipping the classroom, is if we give our students more work outside of class, are they likely to do it? And, you know, or some of us might be challenged to get our students to do the current amount of work, let alone now do the reading and watch this video or listen to this podcast and extra stuff. So, you know, without having some percentage of the course grade tied to doing that out of class work through assessment. So in other words, a brief writing assignment, write a summary of the article, take this online quiz, come to class, and we're going to begin every class with a 3-question quiz, and it's going to count as, you know, the whole semester. This will be 10% of your grade, how well you do on these quizzes at the beginning of every class. That's really the key motivational strategy that tends to work for all students, because students do want to have the best grade that they could get in the class. So if something has points tied to it, students are more likely to engage. But that's really the best strategy that we have. I mean, as we give more out-of-class content, it's not reasonable to think that students would continue to do that work for every class. But if your class has a quiz associated with it that's going to show up in class tomorrow, and my homework assignment doesn't have a quiz associated with it, if I'm the student and I'm in both of our classes, I would do the reading for the class with the quiz first before I would do the other reading that doesn't have any points associated with it. So it helped students, they realize that university is a bit of a puzzle, and they figure out how to solve the puzzle to do as well as possible from a grade perspective, and they make those choices.
Well, thank you very, very much, Edward. That was our last question, and we look forward to seeing you and listening to you again. And thank for those who joined the webinar.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate the time speaking with you.